Tonight on First Tuesday.
The only places you can export weapons are the countries that are going to use them. You know, it does very little good to export weapons to Finland, let's say.
The secret shipments of deadly weapons. We follow the trail across 3 continents and expose one country involved in the illegal arms trade. Good evening and welcome to First Tuesday. Selling arms is big business. Only 2 months ago, Britain's biggest ever export deal was proudly signed by Mrs. Thatcher. It was an arms sale to Saudi Arabia worth £10 billion. With contracts that size to be won, the arms industry has a powerful leverage over any domestic government trying to impose embargoes, and that's the threat of lost jobs and of growth at home. The result is compromise and secrecy, and sometimes the sort of scandal that we expose tonight, that of a country passionately committed to peace in public, but which has privately fueled the bloodiest of wars. It's what's come to be known as the Bofors affair.
Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. A country that has achieved for its citizens the highest of living standards, growth and stability. It is the model welfare state, with provisions for health and social services that other nations aspire to. It is the birthplace also of Alfred Nobel, the founder of the famous Peace Prize.
I now call upon Mother Teresa to receive the diploma and the gold medal.
The prize underlines another popular image of Sweden, the symbol of peace and neutrality, the champions of social justice, the country that never goes to war. Olof Palme, Sweden's best remembered Prime Minister, personified for many people those values. In turn, that strengthened his stature and role on the world stage as an internationalist. He founded the Commission on Disarmament and became universally regarded as Sweden's dove of peace. But 2 years ago, the world was stunned by his brutal assassination. He was gunned down here in a Stockholm street, walking home from the cinema with his wife. It's a murder that's never been solved, and one which has changed Sweden forever. In one night, Sweden was said to have lost its innocence. Citizens of Stockholm queued to pay their last respects.
It's a disaster for Sweden. A total disaster. I don't know what to say.
Well, I was very, very sad and shocked, of course. Because, you know, we are not used to this sort of violence in this country.
Oh, we can't believe it. It's like a friend we had that left us.
But with Palme's death, Sweden's character has also undergone re-examination. In fact, it had always had a darker side, which can be traced to the small lakeside town 200 miles from Stockholm, Karlskoga, the hometown of Alfred Nobel. For the founder of the Peace Prize was also the inventor of dynamite, a discovery that spawned the giant Bofors Nobel arms factory.
Sweden has been making its own armaments for scores of years, well before the war. In fact, it was Swedish weapons, Bofors guns, which were on British ships during World War II, made in Sweden. And the Swedes had been exporting high-quality weapons for, 50 years.
During that time, the factory has grown dramatically. It dominates the Karlskoga landscape, forming a massive lakeside manufacturing complex. It employs 7,000 workers. Bofors Nobel provides the lifeblood of the community and forms a central plank in Sweden's economy. Arms sales are booming. Last year, sales reached an all-time high of £450 million. but the pressure to keep selling is intense.
I think when you get a small country like Sweden or Switzerland, which has to have its own industry because it's neutral, it has a tremendous financial problem because it has to have, of course, production runs for its own domestic forces, which are tremendously expensive unless you can sell weapons overseas. So, in fact, it is just those countries that are neutral, and in the case of Sweden, most committed to peace, who often have to be the most aggressive in their arms selling in order to make their domestic arms industry economic and viable. So it is a real dilemma that they face, and the pressure is very considerable to sell abroad all the time.
That pressure has ensured that Bofors Nobel achieve a hard-won reputation for quality as specialists in high-grade weapons. It's pushed neutral Sweden into the top league of the world's arms dealers. But that pressure has also led the company into a succession of corrupt and illegal deals. It's a story that stretches back over 20 years and spreads across 3 continents, and it's not a story Bofors wanted told. For taking these pictures, we were arrested. It's a story also that has stained the reputation of Olof Palme as a man of peace along the way.
Olof Palme was well aware that you could not maintain a level of technology that would compete on the world market in defense if you did not export weapons. And the only places you can export weapons are to countries that are going to use them. You know, it does very little good to export weapons to Finland, let's say. You know, the biggest markets today are Iran, Iraq, Israel, Syria, Egypt, Libya.
But it is precisely countries like these that are forbidden to receive arms under Swedish export rules. Strict parliamentary guidelines forbid arms sales not only to countries at war, but to regions of potential conflict as well. It's a ban that applies to the very countries who are most in need of weapons. Bofors Nobel ran straight into difficulties with these restrictions when they developed a high-tech rocket system, the RBS-70.
The RBS-70 is a laser-guided missile. It works by a laser homing system. In other words, it projects a laser beam to the target, and the missile then rides the beam to its target. And unlike a heat-seeking missile, it does not go up the tailpipe of an aircraft. It hits it broadside. So either it hits and it explodes into a million pieces, or it simply misses.
Bofors' first 2 important overseas customers for the RBS-70 missile were Dubai and Bahrain. But when the deal was completed, the government refused export permission. They invoked the guidelines forbidding overseas sales because of the growing tension in the Middle East. Bofors had a problem.
Well, I think that the management at Bofors and Karlskrona, they were in a very difficult situation. They saw that if they didn't continue with arms sales that had been promised, that the company would get a very unreliable reputation on the international arms market, and this in turn would affect future sales of the company.
Furthermore, Karlskoga is a company town, and Bofors was afraid for jobs.
If Bofors wasn't able to sell arms abroad, the town could eventually collapse, fail, pack up.
So Bofors deliberately embarked on the path of illegality. They decided to flout the government ban and ship the arms secretly to the Middle East anyway. And they banked on the fierce loyalty of the workforce, anxious to keep their jobs in not betraying them. And they would have got away with it, but for one man, Ingvar Bratt, a Bofors engineer disillusioned with the arms industry.
Just before I left Bofors, I became aware that RB-70 was delivered to Dubai and Bahrain, but without any permission from the Swedish government. So I was at that time against arms export totally. I objected to it, and that's why I left Bofors. So I wanted to search for documents showing how the RB-70 system was delivered to these countries.
These documents that Bratt removed from Bofors prove the RBS-70 did indeed go illegally to the banned Gulf states. But the top Bofors officials claimed there was nothing wrong with the sale, as they'd been given official approval by this man, Carl Fredrik Algernon, head of the government's War Materials Inspectorate, Sweden's top arms official. He can't confirm or deny this, because he is dead. He had a furious row with the head of Bofors Nobel here at his office. The row was about whether or not Algernon had indeed given permission for arms sales to the Middle East. Afterwards, he descended the escalator to Stockholm's Central Underground station. It was his normal route home. According to eyewitnesses, he stood on the platform, but let several trains pass through without boarding. Then, he jumped.
You cannot interrogate a corpse, and corpses are very convenient in this sort of case.
We have obtained documents from Algernon's briefcase, found after his death. On one page he wrote, "I would like to fulfill my job to clean up inside Bofors. My personal situation is today very, very hard." In another cryptic comment he wrote, "The attitude of Palmer, wrongly unsuitable." The official verdict on Algernon, accidental death. Kenneth Timmerman is in no doubt that the government would have given tacit approval for secret arms deals, and that meant Palmer knew as well.
Major arms deals like this in a small country like Sweden invariably go up to the Prime Minister's office. The arms export director is appointed by the politicians. He's appointed by the Foreign Trade Minister, who is appointed by the Prime Minister. All of those people work together. And the Prime Minister must approve major arms deals as well.
The Swedish government, in fact, has a long history of turning a blind eye to its own arms embargo. When American bombs rained down on Hanoi during the Vietnam War, Olof Palme spoke out passionately against the conflict. He marched on the streets of Stockholm with protesters opposed to the war. The Swedish government agreed to an arms embargo on the United States and its allies. But when Australia entered the war in 1966, their helicopters brought more than troops. They carried guns and ammunition made in Sweden, made by FFV, the Swedish state's own arms company. FFV wanted to keep supplying arms to Australia despite the embargo. In the fiercely competitive arms world, delivery of contract is all important, as a former company director, Sigfrid Axelsson, now admits.
And if we couldn't deliver to Australia, I think we should get a very, very bad reputation. Other countries couldn't trust us. So I think it was important from that point of view.
In London, the British came to the rescue. They agreed the arms could be secretly shipped to Australia via Britain in a multi-million-dollar deal which underlined the Swedish government's willingness to break its own arms embargo.
There was an understanding from the government that we could export the Australian ammunition to Great Britain, and Great Britain was ready to send it further to Australia.
But there were bigger Swedish arms scandals to come, now involving Bofors Nobel and the future Prime Minister, Olof Palme. In 1980, one of the longest wars of the 20th century broke out when Iraq declared war on Iran. It was to continue for the next 8 years. Olof Palme was appointed the official UN mediator. The former protester was now a peacemaker come of age. But Palme's sympathy with Iran, the underdog, was to put him in a compromising position.
Well, there's a terrible paradox, I think, that very often mediators or peacemakers do find themselves dealing with weapons as a means of, as they see it, of exercising pressure or having influence with governments on one side or another. And before they know where they are, they become part of the arms-dealing nexus themselves. That, of course, is because of the theory that when you've got countries at war, the only influence you can have is by supplying them with some weapons in order then to withhold them or to threaten to withhold them as the means of pressure. But, of course, very often that can be a self-deceiving process in which the peacemaker does, in fact, become a kind of war maker.
Palmer's relationship with Iran was total. He offered the Iranians, it was not just a question of weapons, he offered them technological support. Volvo was selling trucks, ASEA was selling electronics equipment, and he opened the doors to just about all of Swedish technology, all of Swedish manufactured goods, and he also gave the Iranians a certain extent of diplomatic respectability.
Henrik Westander, a researcher on Sweden's arms industry, has also monitored the record of shipments to Iran.
Sweden has been an important supplier of military equipment to Iran. For example, Volvo trucks, Boghammar patrol boats that has been used in the Gulf War, and Bofors has built a factory for producing explosives in Isfahan in Iran. In total, I think the Swedish military deliveries to Iran during 81 and 85 has been to a value of 250 million pounds.
And that's not all that went to Iran. These handwritten notes reveal the existence of another chapter in the arms scandal: the clandestine activities of a group of major European explosives manufacturers, a cartel presided over by Sweden's Bofors Nobel.
Well, a cartel always has one principal aim. It's to control the market. That's what they did for the powder, ammunition and explosives trade in Europe. And they were the biggest producers on the market. So they were very strong and they were able to control it. They fixed the prices on the European market. They fixed the prices for outside Europe. As soon as there were very big contracts, they decided to go for it together.
And the biggest contract of all was the Iran-Iraq War. Whilst the death toll on both sides mounted to more than 1 million, the need for explosives was so great that no single supplier could meet the demand. In one deal alone, Iran ordered 5,500 tons of explosives, the equivalent of the annual output of 5 European manufacturers. Westminster Abbey, the heart of central London. In 1982, the first cartel deal was agreed here at the Iranian arms buying headquarters in Victoria Street, Westminster, the NDIO. To fulfill the order, the cartel shipments were organized by the aggressive marketing manager of Nobel Chemie in Sweden, Mats Lundberg. He deliberately advocated illegal arms sales to politically high-risk countries like South Africa as a means of reviving Bofors Nobel's flagging overseas sales. He produced what he termed an easy guide for his colleagues, advising them how to smuggle arms illegally from source to destination. If successful, the guide concludes, everybody lives happily ever after. Lundberg's plan was to ship the explosives to one of 3 front companies in Italy, Greece or Yugoslavia. The pretense was that those countries would be the final destination. But the same consignments were then to be secretly re-exported to Iran. And here, on the remote west coast of Scotland, a major British company became involved. This is the distribution point for one of Britain's biggest explosives manufacturers. They have been the major British player in this cartel. Nobel Explosives is a division of ICI. In 1984, the cartel won an order for explosives worth £30 million. Tirrenia, an Italian company, was to be used as the front for the deal. It was so large that 5 of the cartel member companies had to join forces to meet the demand. The order was was for a total of 5,300 tons of propellant charge for ammunition. ICI Nobel, for their part, were to supply 900 tons of high-quality explosives, in breach of the British government's embargo on arms sales to both sides in the Gulf War. In the summer of 1984, the company shipped its first consignment of 50 tons to Italy, from here on the first stage of the journey to Iran. But the deal fell through after the Italian government blocked the contract. A new figure came onto the scene. This man, Carl Erich Schmitz, just when the cartel needed fresh inspiration.
Carl Schmitz is a Swedish businessman who was trusted by the people in Tehran, who asked him to go for arms and ammunition wherever he could get it. And so he went to South Africa first. The deal was stopped, and then Schmitz went to Bofors and was a middleman between Tehran and the cartel in Europe, organizing the transport, the financing of organizing the deliveries from the different members of the cartel to Tehran.
Schmitz went to any length to fulfill Iranian needs, as this telex to Iran reveals. We are just now breaking all existing laws and regulations to make it possible to supply the goods to your organization. This fresh order from the Iranian National Defense Industries Organization, the NDIO, replaced the one that had collapsed. It was for 18,000 tons of propellant and explosives and would bring the cartel $45 million. For their part, ICI Nobel shipped 100 tons of military explosives to Sweden from their private port. But its final destination was to be Bandar Abbas in Iran. ICI Nobel denied that they knew the shipments were intended for Iran. A customs investigation in Britain found no evidence of illegality. But in fact, the cartel met here in Paris, and documents from that meeting show clearly that the Iranian National Defense Organization was the real customer.
Because in the documents that all the companies involved in the Tirana deal got in Paris at a meeting of the cartel, there is mentioned the real client not being Tirana but being Tehran. There is mentioned in the document NDIO, which is the Defense Industry Organization in Tehran. In the document there is also mentioned that the material of the cartel members will arrive in Italy but will be shipped from there. So there isn't any doubt about it. They definitely knew that this was not really the end user, Tirana. It was just an intermediary, and the real client behind that was Tehran.
And now, the prime mover in the cartel, Mats Lundberg, is the first person to break silence and admits they did know the explosives would end up in Iran.
I had a good hunch that the client who was to buy ammunition from Tirana was an Iranian organization known in the trade as NDIO. And I spoke about my hunch at that meeting, yes.
For their part, ICI refused to comment further and declined to be interviewed. An inquiry announced by the Ministry of Defense into the affair has been dropped. But meanwhile, explosives manufactured at one of the government's own arms factories also fueled the Iranian war effort in 1986. Inadvertently, it is claimed. They were principally shipped from the private wharves of Riddham Dock in Kent. 8 consignments of military explosives totaling 300 tons. The source was the government Royal Ordnance Factory in Bridgewater, Somerset. Royal Ordnance deny they knew the explosives would end up in Iran. They say they thought they were bound for Greece. But the cartel finally came unstuck. Customs officials in Germany have become suspicious of railway wagons sitting in these marshalling yards in Stade Elbe near Hamburg. the shipment had already attracted their attention, having travelled to the Austrian border and returned in an attempt to disguise its true final destination. Inside, customs officials discovered 80,000 kilograms of explosives for anti-aircraft shells. The plan was to have shipped the consignment from this discreet backwater that flows into the river Elbe, and from there to Syria, a country forbidden to receive munitions under Sweden's export laws. Swedish customs subsequently raided the Karlskoga offices of Nobel Chemie, a division of the Nobel Empire. They took away thousands of documents revealing the extent of the deception. As a result, Cartel Supremo Mats Lundberg now faces criminal charges for gross smuggling. But in Karlskoga, his reputation is intact.
It's a pleasure for me to go to the grocery store or the mail office. People are noticing me, people are talking to me much more than they did before. They keep slapping my back, wishing me luck and so on. So I have had no problems at all at home in that sense. Whatever I did, right or wrong, it was not for my personal gain or anything like that. It was concern about the company and the employees of the company, and they give me credit for that.
"10,000 miles across the other side of the world, Singapore, one of the busiest commercial ports, a centre for international trade. Here, arms imports have become a major industry, and once more, Bofors were at the heart of it.
If you look at Swedish foreign trade statistics here, you find in 1985, tiny Singapore becomes Sweden's #2 arms purchaser. And they become that way for 1984, for 1985, 1986. They're buying 14.5% of all Swedish arms exports. These are official statistics from the Swedish Foreign Trade Ministry. They would very much like to ignore those. And Singapore is certainly not using all of those weapons.
Indeed, Singapore had become a highly valued conduit for arms smuggling from Sweden to the Gulf and the Far East. This man, Tang Kok Cheng, until recently worked as the general manager of Allied Ordnance. Based here in the Tanglin shopping centre, it operated as an arms purchasing company, jointly owned by Bofors and the government of Singapore. And this Bofors document reveals a secret consultant agreement by which Tan would receive a 1.5% commission on all Bofors sales to Singapore. Nearly $300,000 of Tan's payoff was brought to him at the Tanglin shopping centre in used $100 bills. The rest was deposited in a Swiss bank account. And this financial statement shows the regular payments he received from Bofors from spring 1984 to 1986, largely in Swedish currency. In all, 7 million kroner, plus other currencies, a total of $1.2 million. Tan's job, for which he was so handsomely rewarded, was to circumvent Swedish arms export laws by forging end-user certificates.
Well, basically, an end-user certificate is simply a guarantee that the weapons sold from one country are in fact going to another country, and that is their correct destination. and that they will not then be re-exported or diverted. But of course, it becomes very tempting to either forge the certificate or to send it to one country and then to divert it, or to send it on from the official destination to another illegal destination afterwards, which is why their certificates have a very special role in the arms trade, and indeed can be forged or bought or sold, and can be used by certain governments who then pass on the weapons knowing that they're going illegally elsewhere.
The Swedish authorities granted this genuine end-user certificate. It's one of many that Tan used for his business deals. It permitted his company to import 2 consignments of ammunition from Sweden. After it had been endorsed by the Singapore authorities, this is that same document, with 2 more consignments fraudulently added by Tan, consignments for which permission had not been granted. It was a trick that worked repeatedly. But in July 1987, Tan was arrested on 51 separate charges of forgery and corruption. In court, his defence was that Bofors partly owned the company he worked for, and that the deals were made with the connivance of Bofors' top managers. And whilst the Swedish arms manufacturers went free, Tan went to jail. He remains behind bars in Singapore's Changi prison, serving a 4-year sentence. Tan was the fall guy. But the pressure on Bofors Nobel was mounting. Back in Sweden, the customs and police investigation was now making headway. And just as the company were recovering from one set of revelations, the most recent scandal broke. New Delhi, the capital of India, and a new and disturbing chapter in the Bofors affair. Their activities here, competing for lucrative defence contracts, embroiled not only Olaf Palme, but continues to severely embarrass the Gandhi government. But the story begins on the northwest frontier. One of the frequent and bloody border clashes between Pakistan and India over disputed territory. The Indians, who felt outmatched by Pakistan's superior weaponry, decided to re-equip their army, a contract worth £800 million, with 400 new long-range howitzers. Field trials narrowed the choice to 3 possible guns, one from France, one from Britain, and Sweden's 155mm howitzer, made by Bofors. But the Indian Army's preference was for the French gun. It had a longer range, was easier to operate, and was cheaper.
The Army's reports have been published. Out of 17 experts, 16 had opted for the French gun. They didn't say that the Bofors gun was bad, but for our needs, they felt that the French gun was better.
From the government's own records, it seems that till a few weeks before the contract was actually signed, the French gun was the preferred gun. And then something seems to have happened in the last 2-3 weeks.
Only Bofors itself knows what happened, but they were certainly under strong pressure to win the contract.
Bofors was on the brink of letting go of workers. Part of the reason was that they had expanded their production and capacity to take care of what were expected to be large Swedish military orders, which did not come through. If they didn't get any big orders soon, they would have to start laying off workers. Palme was very aware of this. Palme was, as a social democrat, was committed to full employment. And to lose 800 workers would look very bad. At that point, he became involved in selling the artillery to India.
In January 1986, Olaf Palme flew to New Delhi. Rajiv Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, was hosting a disarmament conference, and Palme, the peacemaker, made a special point of attending. His former advisor on disarmament issues, John Edwards, recalls the occasion.
Yes, he was there at a meeting of the Commission, discussed disarmament and peace issues. That's quite correct. But I think he obviously used that opportunity to discuss the Bofors India's deal at the same time with the Prime Minister of India. I mean, it's well known that funerals would also be used for such arms selling trips and things like this. So that wouldn't be anything unusual, I don't think.
But he's discussing peace in the morning and selling arms in the afternoon, basically.
Yes.
Bofors president Martin Ardbo was also in India and flew back with Palmer. A month later, he heard that their mission had been successful. Against all expectation, Bofors was awarded the Indian contract. It was the biggest export order in Swedish history. The workforce was saved from redundancies. He hoisted the Indian flag above his home in Karlskoga. But in India, questions were asked about the deal. Olaf Palme had given his word to Rajiv Gandhi that there would be no middlemen or commissions involved. Commissions have a special significance in the arms trade.
Well, I think the whole arms dealing industry really rests on commissions, because it is, of course, those very large commissions which are the main motivation for the dealers themselves and which cause them to be so agile and so ingenious. Of course, they depend on collecting money, often by charging far more for the weapons they're selling than the buyer ever knows to be the actual price. So the commission is concealed in the price that is sold to the actual buyer in the end. But of course, on the way, that profit is used to pay commissions or very often direct bribes to people to ease the passage of the weapons through those various bits of the bureaucracy in one country or another.
Rajiv Gandhi has personally said that not only commissions, he said that Sweden has assured us, he said it in Parliament, that no payments have been made into Swiss banks and there were no middlemen.
But despite Sweden's assurance to Gandhi, this document shows that Bofors had indeed made a series of payments into Swiss bank accounts, the total over £30 million.
The payments were made nominally to 3 front companies. The largest amount of about £15 million went to a company called Svenska, which is incorporated in Panama. The other is a code name called Moresco. And the third set of payments went to a company called A&E Services.
A.E. Services is a little-known British company. Exactly what kind of work they perform is unclear. But here, in Guildford High Street, are their registered offices. They received 50 million kroner. That's about £5 million of the payments. Money that relates to this 1985 agreement between Bofors and A.E. Services. It shows that A.E. Services would provide such advisory, consultancy and support services as may be necessary to help Bofors win the howitzer contract. And the fee? For its part, the company stood to make 3% of the total contract price of £800 million. That's £24 million. In India, concern about the payments resulted in a parliamentary inquiry which concluded there was no evidence that the payments were for bribes or for commissions paid to middlemen. A Major Robert Wilson gave evidence to that inquiry. He signed the agreement with Bofors as a director and solicitor of A.E. Services. He's a former Gurkha officer who's now a solicitor specialising in defence contracts. He's also the international taxation consultant to the Defence Manufacturers Association. He says the £5 million A.E. Services received was not a commission. It was a cancellation fee, paid because the contract to help Bofors could not be performed after Gandhi and Palmer had decreed there should be no middlemen. Major Wilson's country home, Goosery Cottage, a secluded woodlands retreat on the outskirts of Guildford. It is also his private office. He agreed to speak to us, but not to be filmed.
In no way do I want to appear to be avoiding this issue. I can't answer for AES, you see. Yes. This is a company which I no longer are.
Yes.
But in effect, the situation of privilege between solicitor and client prevails.
The Department of Trade disclosed that AE Services was dissolved 3 months ago and had not traded since October 1982. Parliamentary questions have failed to elicit more about the company.
I can't answer for AES. AES, the company, used to be my client, no longer is. Any question of that sort have really got to be asked of the officers of the company. And that really leaves only Mr. Stott,
Right.
who will simply say to you that he's got nothing to say, also he's out of reach.
Fellow Englishman Miles Stott operates from his base here in Geneva. A chartered accountant, he was reluctant to acknowledge his connection with AE Services, denying he had ever been a shareholder. In fact, company records show he has been a shareholder for 10 years and variously director, chairman and company secretary. We called his office in Geneva again.
Shall I repeat then what I said first time round, which is that I am not a shareholder? Look, I really don't have any more comments to make on any matters. The whole thing has got so ridiculous and that I don't have any comments to make.
Major Wilson told us the £5 million was transferred to AE Services holding company, Chow and Stolt, a company which provides intelligence and information to arms manufacturers.
I think the more you look into it, the more you find that the master players were the arms dealers and not the governments who thought they were making use of them. It was always the arms dealers who were dominant because they were really the spiders at the center of the web.
But the knowledge that the Swedish government, and Olof Palme in particular, have become entangled in that spider's web on such a scale will force most Swedes to think again, both about their country and their Prime Minister. At the time of his death, it was a different story, as commemorated by Swedish television.
It was an un-Swedish homage to an un-Swedish leader, the victim of a totally un-Swedish brutality. Olof Palme, a non-believer, often used churches to preach his ideas for a better and more peaceful world. But it took a violent death to finally bring home to the Swedish people that abroad, more than at home, this man was viewed as a prophet of our time.
I have many Swedish friends as well as Swedish relatives, and it has been a very painful investigation for them. Many illusions about Sweden's role in the world and Swedish innocence have been stripped away. Discovering that Olof Palme, who had a reputation as a man of peace, was in fact brokering billion-dollar arms deals, such as happened in India. Well, this was a deal worth more than $1 billion. These kind of revelations have been very painful to many Swedes, because they see that Palme was in fact a politician like any other politician.
In all, 5 senior Nobel Bofors managers, including former president of the company, Martin Ardbo, are now facing criminal proceedings in Sweden for their role in the Bofors affair. The first to face trial will be Mats Lundberg, whose case comes up in October. In Britain, ICI were invited to join us in the studio, but they declined. But to discuss the wider implications of the Swedish arms scandal, we do have in the studio John Reid, who's a defence industry consultant, and Erin Karp of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Erin Karp, if I could start with you, what will this have meant, do you think, to the Swedes, the discovery that Olof Palme, who was such a hero to them, was masquerading as a peacemaker on one hand, but hustling for arms sales on the other?
Not just Olof Palme, but the entire nation. Their self-esteem has taken a pretty rude shock. For a very long time, the Swedes thought that they played by a different set of rules, a better set of rules than most nations. And they've learned now that they're not much different from anybody else.
So a blow to their piety?
A blow to their piety, to be sure, and also a basic blow to some of the most essential foundations of their sense of nationality, of their sense of national pride.
Well, John Reid, I mean, how can a neutral, peace-loving country like Sweden find itself fueling bloody wars? Is that the inevitable result of having to have an arms industry in a neutral country?
I think that any nation that has an arms industry and hopes to provide weapons for its own defence at a price that it can afford must inevitably seek global markets for those weapons. The Swedish industry was constrained by having its outlets fairly clearly defined as Finland, Austria, similar neighbouring countries, and was obliged to seek covert ways and government support to secure those larger markets. It was doing a marketing job.
So that's what most Swedes would have expected their government to do, despite the public commitment to neutrality and the finding of world peace?
I think they would have expected their government to support a key industry that was at the leading edge of technology and that was clearly in such an important part in the national economy.
So a slight conflict between their vanity at being an important technocratic power and their view of themselves as world peacemakers.
Very definitely. One sense that when talking to the Swedish arms industry at about this time, you felt that they were constrained, they felt that they were unable to do their job properly, they needed the markets. How were they going to get them? This was the problem that they faced.
Well, Aaron Karp, again, wasn't that a problem for a social democratic leader committed to full employment? The tension between jobs for your own people and the intention to find world peace.
More than just jobs were at stake. For the Swedes, also, their basic national security. They depend upon those arms industries themselves. In case of war, they're going to have to rely upon them and not anyone else's help because they're a neutral. Now, keeping those industries going in peacetime is an expensive matter. And if you can get the other guy to pay for it, that's much preferable to asking your own taxpayers.
So, in the end, are the Social Democrats, after Olof Palme, going to suffer in the forthcoming elections because of what's happened?
Things are very, very tight coming into the forthcoming elections, and no one's sure what the outcome's going to be. A lot of people think the Social Democrats are hurt by this and by many other scandals that have affected Swedish society in the last 2 years. It's been a very difficult time for Sweden. Other people suggest, however, that all the scandals may actually help the Social Democrats, that their party faithful are going to all turn around the mast, and they're all going to bind together in a time of trouble. The most likely result will be some kind of stalemate.
But basically the message coming from the Social Democrats, in the end, we cared about you, we cared about your jobs.
It's interesting. That's exactly the message that they're putting forward in all of their advertising.
And somebody like
We
Mats,
care about you.
We care about you. Somebody like Mats Lundberg, then, the man who is charged with having been involved in this dynamite exporting cartel. He says he's a local hero. Would that be the case generally in Sweden?
He's not a hero of mine, but a lot of people think that he's a simple scapegoat.
Right. Well, John Reid, we're often shocked at Swedish readiness to hustle for arms. How clean are Britain's hands on this front, do you think?
I don't think any country that has a major arms industry can lay claim to having entirely free, clean hands. The problem is quite simply that they are obliged to go and get sales where the need is. The need is in places of the parts of the world where there's tension, and they have to use covert means, they have to use any manner of means to secure those sales.
So Britain, like the Swedish arms industry, would be ready to pay what is euphemistically called commission, would be ready to break its own arm embargoes, would it?
I don't think that it's so easy to say that it would break its own arms embargoes. It would certainly have to use the commission system when it was part of the culture of the country in which they were hoping to do business. They would be less inclined to break the embargoes of their own volition as companies. But if the government was fronting up the deal, then I think the ways would be found round the regulations, the limitations.
You know the industry well. You've talked a lot to arms manufacturers. How do they see their job? I mean, do they feel that they're simply producing a product like any other product and they'll sell it to anybody who's got the money to pay for it?
They see themselves, as any business sees itself, bound to produce a profit for its shareholders. They're made up with people from the marketing, the financial, production disciplines. Sure, they need special engineering, but at the end of the day, they have to sell their goods and declare a profit on it.
So whether it's guns or Mars bars, they'll sell them?
They'll sell them, precisely.
Aaron Karp, there have been some people who say that the only way to have greater control of the arms industry is to nationalise the arms industry, whatever one's ideological attitude is, and that way at least one would know how much was being made, what it was being made for, whose hands it was going to end up in. Do you think there's an argument for that?
I think there's an argument, but it's a pretty weak one. In the end, I suspect that nationalization would only change the identity of the sinners, not the practices. We've seen examples where countries that have completely nationalized arms industries, such as Eastern European nations, have found their arms exports completely out of control. Poland and Romania, for example, selling to the Nicaraguan Contras in complete contradiction of their foreign policies.
John Reid, quickly, the argument for nationalising the industry, greater control?
I think there would be no greater control. I think that a nationalised industry would merely give government a finger on the trigger that would enable it to complete more deals with less respectable customers.
Right. John Reid and Aaron Karp, thank you both very much. A fairly pessimistic view then of what's going to be happening to the arms industry and the arms race. And that's all from us for this month. First Tuesday is going to be back next month at the same time. Until then, good night.